Hello everyone, thank you very much for inviting me here actually to talk to you. This is an incredibly important area, and this is a phrase from an American poet and farmer called Wendell Berry. People are fed by the food industry, which pays no attention to health, and they are treated by the health industry, which pays no attention to food. And that's a situation that has to change if we're going to solve the food crisis and the obesity crisis. Just a little bit about me first of all. I'm an organic farmer. I farm in the North Cotswolds with my sister Rosamond, who wrote The Secret Life of Cows, which is a book about our herd of cattle and the interrelationships between the animals in that herd, which she's observed, we've both observed over many years, showing how much more intelligent and sentient animals are than most people have accepted in the past. And she's had amazing success with it, completely unexpectedly. It sold over 100,000 copies in the last year, and it's coming out in 25 different language editions around the world. We farmed organically since 1974, used no fertilisers or pesticides in that time. We've got 400 very beautiful acres on the edge of the Cotswolds. We grow organic bread-making wheat and organic porridge oats, and we also keep sheep and cattle. Now, I worked for the Soil Association for 26 years and played a leading role in setting organic standards back in the 1980s. But in 2013, I was persuaded to join a new charity called the Sustainable Food Trust, which was set up by Patrick Holden in 2011, and it has a mission to accelerate the transition to more sustainable food systems globally. And just quickly through some of our key campaigns at the moment, we're working on true cost accounting, looking at the true cost of food when you take into account the negative and the positive aspects which aren't accounted for in the price. And what we found in a major report we published last year is that for every pound you spend on food, we're actually spending, through our taxes and other water charges and other means, we're spending another pound at least in hidden ways we don't realise. And the only way that we'll actually change the food system is if we actually take these hidden costs into account. We're looking at sustainability metrics. That's a system of trying to assess the sustainability of all farms so that farmers can actually compare their progress over time, becoming more sustainable. We're looking at how to match sustainable diets and agriculture together, so healthy diets and sustainable farming. We're also looking at a whole range of issues associated with food security, with climate change, and all the things that are happening on the world which are making food production come under threat. And we're running a specific campaign to try to save small abattoirs, because small abattoirs are closing as it was due to commercial pressures, really largely driven by supermarkets, but a range of other factors. And that means that local meat producers like me, who want to get our animals slaughtered and sold locally to save food miles, to save the environment and to save animal welfare issues, are being forced to take our animals further and further afield to get them slaughtered, which is very unfortunate. Now, the challenges that we face are soil degradation. This is a map from 2002. In fact, this is the latest report. Didn't have time to get a map from it, but the latest report shows things have got much worse. The red areas are where you've got severe soil degradation. The orange and yellow areas where you've got moderate soil degradation. And the actual statistics from a few years ago, the current report is saying that 75% of all farmland now is degraded to some extent. A decade ago, the United Nations Environment Programme said that just over half of all farmland was degraded, and a third of it was severely degraded. We're losing 24 billion tonnes of topsoil a year from agriculture. That's 3.4 tonnes for every man, woman and child on the planet. That means that for every supermarket trolley you bring home, you're effectively tipping 3 or 4 supermarket trolleys of soil into the river every year as a result of the food systems we're depending on. And we're losing 12 million hectares of food producing land every year. Very quickly, 2,000 hectares a day are lost just from salinisation alone, and that's a large part of that is due to inappropriate irrigation projects, which when I grew up to school, it was the sort of thing to dam a river, get some hydroelectric power, irrigate the crops and increase productivity. It's worked for a few decades, but over time in very hot countries, the water evaporates very quickly and the salts in the water then turn the land over time so that it can't any longer produce food. And in the last 20 years, an area the size of France has been lost to food production just from salinisation. One other thing just to mention is that healthy food systems which recycle nutrients and don't just depend on fertilisers and chemicals produce that the bacteria in the soil produce a dark organic matter called humus, and there's a very, very important relationship between this and plant roots. And a question I'll leave you with is whether or not food systems that are based around building nutrients in this natural way actually produce food that's more nutritious, had a high level of micronutrients in. We've got studies showing consistently that organic food has high levels of important micronutrients which are helpful, beneficial to health, but it's still not really widely accepted in government policy. And a further question is, because we've been constantly told the way to solve food hunger is new technological advances in agriculture which will increase yields. But there's a question which hasn't been addressed, which is, as every time we increase yield from land, will that actually mean that the food is less nutritious? Because it isn't just nitrogen, phosphorus and potash that's needed. There's a wide range of minerals, for example selenium, which is very important to our health, and zinc, which is also another antioxidant important to our health. Now, if many soils are already low in these nutrients in the UK, so if we're producing 4 tonnes per acre, where 30, 50 years ago we produced 1 tonne, does that crop have less of these micronutrients in it? That's a question I leave for future people to answer, but I think there's a serious issue there. This photograph in the middle is actually soil degradation in the UK occurring in Suffolk recently. You'd think that was Africa. And a study from Cranfield University found that the actual cost of the UK economy of soil degradation in the UK alone is £1.33 billion per year. Our crop production is actually leading to an unsustainable food system. Very quickly, other key issues which have to be addressed. There's 3.5 times more reactive nitrogen in the ecosystem now than the planet can support. That's come mostly from nitrogen fertiliser, which is made from natural gas, which is a finite resource and a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. How are we going to produce food in the future when natural gas has either become too expensive or run out? It's a question which will actually affect your generation, because even BP says we've only got enough natural gas on the planet to last us another 40 or 50 years. Phosphates are essential for plant growth, but there are only very few phosphate reserves in the world, and because we use them extravagantly and they get washed back down the river, we're running out of phosphates. It's estimated that within 50 to 100 years there will be very few reserves of easily accessible phosphates. And current cropping systems depend very heavily on the herbicide glyphosate, about which an increasing number of health concerns have been raised. In particular, its potential to cause non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a very nasty cancer which has affected a large number of people in countries where glyphosate is being used. And also, because glyphosate is an organophosphate, there are 4 studies which are suggesting this may be behind a decline in IQ, a small decline of about 2% in IQ in children across the whole of Europe. And a cost of something near close to 300 billion euros a year has been calculated as a cost to society just from that decline in IQ. We're also seeing an increasing amount of virgin land converted to cropland, and alongside that is a biodiversity problem, and we've also got these major diet-related disease problems, including obesity and, at the other extent, malnutrition. Now, just on biodiversity, let's look at this photograph. This is East Anglia, taken from an aeroplane, and all you can really see, with a few tiny exceptions, is oilseed rape and wheat. The problem here is these crops are grown in monocultures. Now, pollinating insects, particularly bumblebees, which can't be moved like honeybees, will do very nicely on the oilseed rape in April and May when it's flowering, but once it's finished flowering, there's nowhere for them to go to get food. And some bumblebees only have a range of 300 metres from their nest. So if there isn't a continuous supply of nectar, and what they would have depended on in the past is grassland with legumes in it and weeds in it, so they would and hedgerows on farms, we're seeing this dramatic decline in pollinating insects, which are critically important for food production. Now, the answer that has been widely promoted by young people of your generation and campaigners is that the solution is to eat less meat, and particularly to eat less red meat. But I'm going to raise some questions to make you think about whether that really is the way forward, particularly in a country like UK. Is it better to eat red meat or white meat? Just very quickly here, global trends in meat consumption. There's a huge problem, particularly with the growing population, increasing affluence. Meat consumption is on an upward trajectory. But if you look at the bottom, the turquoise line right at the bottom is sheep numbers, and they've only increased 18% in the last 60 years. And the next line up is beef cattle, which has only increased by about 40%, whereas chicken production has increased dramatically. And what's happening here, if you just look at these figures here, young people on average under the 30s are eating just 15 grams of lamb a week, whereas people of my generation are eating around about 60 grams of lamb a week, and there's a gradation in age groups between these the older people and younger people. And the problem here is that because we've got 70% almost of our farmland is grass, and it's not really, much of that's not suitable for anything else, we're moving away from eating the meats and getting the protein and the fats which we can produce naturally in this country to eating proteins and fats which are dependent on imported soya and other imports. And just very quickly here, this is beef and chicken consumption. The red line is chicken consumption, how that's dramatically increased over the last 60 years, and how beef consumption has fallen, and there's a very similar line for sheep if we were to put it on there. Now, ruminants do have the problem of methane emissions. There's also nitrous oxide coming from manures, and when fertilisers are used to keep livestock, you will also have a problem with nitrous oxide, another greenhouse gas. But we forget about, well, just to show you here, this is a pie chart. Agriculture globally, the methane, greenhouse gases from agriculture are around about 7%. You hear people say it's 50% or something like that. The actual figures are around about 7% from agriculture. When you add land use change into that, it takes it up to 20%. And you can add a little bit more for transport, for example, and things like that, yes?
What do you mean by land use change?
How do land use change, you say? Land use change is, for example, if I were to take a grass field that's been down to grass for a long time and plough it up to grow cereals and turn it into arable cropland, that would be land use change. But the major land use change, which is defined in this figure here, is the conversion of the Amazon rainforest from forest to agriculture, either grassland for cattle or soya production. And I'll show you a slide of that in a moment or two. One of the key points, though, is in the UK, we are not undertaking a significant amount of land use change. Most of our grassland is staying as grassland. A little bit has been converted to cropland. But this is if we bring in the conversion of land in South America, it gives us a very different picture, and that really relates to intensive grain-fed animals rather than grass-fed animals in the UK. In the UK, agriculture is responsible for about 10% of our emissions, and just to cut to the bottom, because I'm going to run out of time before too long, if you take the average consumption of red meat in this country, which is 18.2 kilograms of beef and 4.9 kilograms of lamb, if that beef comes from the dairy herd, where admittedly emissions are slightly lower than they are from the beef herd, that equates to 520 kilograms of carbon dioxide per year for an average red meat eater in this country. But my boss, Patrick Holden, went to the EAT Forum in Sweden the same week that I was doing this calculation, and his carbon footprint from his one trip to Sweden and back was 560 kilograms. And at that conference, there were a large number of vegan and vegetarian campaigners from the west coast of America, and their one trip to the Stockholm Meat Festival and back was equivalent to 6 years red meat consumption. So I'm not suggesting that the methane emissions from ruminants should be ignored, but we do need to put them in context. And this is one of the contexts we should think about, because this is how soya is now being produced in South America and other parts of the world. And you can very easily see why something like 800 million tons of soil every year is being washed away in Brazil and Argentina. Yes?
It's not true that a lot of the soy that's being produced in South America is being fed to beef and other sorts of animals, but animal agriculture. I'm
quite deaf, and I haven't got. Is the question: are we feeding that soy to livestock? Yes. Well, it's a very interesting question. If you take the soybean, only 11% of it is oil. Now, we humans are consuming all that oil from the soy that's produced. 80% goes into food, mostly as modified fats in processed foods. 20% goes into diesel, biodiesel for use in town buses, and into other things like cosmetics and hairspray and so on, fly spray even. However, so that leaves, you could say that 89% of the soya is being fed to livestock. In fact, that's not quite true, because we import 3.1 million tonnes of soya into this country every year. Of that, only 1.1 million tonnes is fed to livestock. About 1 million tonnes goes into the food industry, and 1 million tonnes is used for pet food and for paint manufacture and for a range of other uses. But the key point that most people don't realise is actually that because we now depend on vegetable oils for our fats, and fats make up close to 40% of our energy intake every day, we are dependent on all that oil. And the irony is, because we've moved away from eating animal fats to vegetables, even if we stop feeding that soya to livestock, we would still need to grow just as much soya these days, because we actually become dependent on the oil. You can't get the oil without having, so you just have a mountain of meal left over at the end. Now, you won't find anyone else saying that, but I've written a detailed article about it on the Sustainable Food Trust website, and you'd be welcome to read it and challenge it if you'd like to. I just wanted to show you here the problem with people who say just grow crops is so much of the UK is iconic scenery, and it wouldn't, there's sheep grazing in there, it would not be suitable to try to grow crops in there. You get soil erosion and you simply wouldn't be able to do it. And here are some statistics. There are things that this is from 2013. Actually, the grassland total is now only 66%, because quite a bit more has been converted to crop production. Looking at diet-related diseases, we've still got, these are a little bit out of date, these figures now. If I had the latest ones, it's probably slightly lower figures. But a large number of people still die from heart attacks, cardiovascular disease, stroke and so on every year. And that's me in 2009 in the intensive care unit of the newly created Bristol Heart Institute, which has only been going 6 weeks. I had what's called an aortic dissection. There's a split in my main aorta. I was only given a 50-50 chance to survive the operation. I've got a stent, rather like Bill Clinton. That's the only thing we've got in common, I should add. But I was lucky enough to have my life saved by a very clever surgeon using keyhole surgery. A decade earlier, I would not have survived. No one had ever survived aortic dissection before they developed techniques to repair the damage with keyhole surgery. And so we've got this, just a few examples, some of the main examples of diet-related disease. Obesity. Now, I'm also obese. I'm clinically obese. My BMI is 34.1. I've lost 1.5 stone in the last couple of years, but I'm still obese and at a higher risk of all these diseases. Now, the reasons why people become obese, the obvious one is that we eat more than we need, because we don't expend enough energy for the amount of food we eat. But the factors behind that have been suggested are the rise of supermarkets in the late 1960s, and the fact that some of us are unable to resist the lure of food as attractively packaged, particularly processed food. And we did evolve as a species that didn't have a reliable food supply. So when we came across food, we tended to overeat, and then we would lose weight on other occasions. And there's also emerging evidence that disturbance of the gut microflora actually makes us less able to manage our weight properly. And although it's not what I wanted, I've actually had 9 courses of antibiotics for various conditions in the last 10 years after having a broken toe, and that got a hospital-acquired infection which required 3 courses of antibiotics to clear it up, and various other reasons. Then we also eat far too much sugar, which is mildly addictive. we moved away from eating whole grains and protein, which suppress the appetite by stilling the hormone ghrelin, and we've also leptin. The leptin is a hormone which, when you eat glucose or sugars or foods that break down to glucose, leptin sends a signal to your brain from your stomach to tell you that you've actually eaten quite a lot of food. It suppresses your appetite. But when you have refined sugar taken out of fruit, if you get sugar out of an apple, you're eating a lot of fibre with it, which slows down the absorption. If you eat apple juice, or if you eat refined sugar, there's no signal sent from fructose like there is from glucose. And so because we've any refined sugars, our body is not getting the signals to tell us when we've had enough to eat. There's also the rise of the diet industry, and there's a book being written, Dieting Makes You Fat. There's a case that was put forward by a Guardian journalist called Jacques Peretti in 2 very interesting BBC Pro series called The Men Who Made Us Fat, and ironically they called it The Men Who Made Us Thin, where Professor Philip James, who was the architect of the Food Standards Agency, played a role in changing the global health recommendations for what was a healthy weight. And that led to the rise of dietary fads, and most people who went on the early diets ended up gaining weight rather than losing weight. Now, this is the Eat Well Guide, which is actually somewhat better. This is the National Health Service Eat Well Guide, which is somewhat better than the Food Standards Agency guide. And there's not time to look at very much of it, but it's still got some major problems in my view. If you look down here in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see the tiny area that's allocated for fats. And it's telling us to eat oils and spreads rather than animal fats. However, we're recommended to get 36% of our energy intake from these fats and oils. In fact, we get close to 39% of our intake from them. And I would certainly challenge the whole issue of whether we've done the right thing, moving away from animal fats to vegetable oils. If we just take beef fat compared with palm oil, both fats are 50% saturated fat, and we are now depending incredibly heavily on this country on 600,000 tonnes of palm oil every year, which is coming from Southeast Asia, from Central Africa, the Congo, where rainforest is being destroyed. 25 orangutans a day are being lost. Now, you can't put palm oil in biscuits, but we could eat diets which actually gave us our fat, the equivalent, the palmitic acid that's in the palm oil, which is what we're all getting. We could be getting that from beef fat, and we're actually incinerating the beef fat, which we used to depend on in this country, in power stations. Now, I just want you to look at this little drink bottle in the top corner, which we've highlighted here. Well, their recommendation, we should drink water and lower fat milk. Now, that's what everyone's doing, drinking skim milk or semi-skim milk. And I just want to I'm trying to raise issues for you so that you actually think a bit more broadly than just what the official advice is these days. This is a headline from a newspaper study. Children who drink full-fat milk are skinnier, the study finds. And here's 2 papers, I just put the titles in here, of studies which have actually found that children who have full cream milk are less overweight than children who have skim milk. And there's a very obvious reason for that. Can anybody think what that might be? Okay, well, as time's short, I'll tell you what my theory is that if you have a good breakfast with some full cream milk, if you're going to have cereals and you have full cream milk on it, you're going to be less hungry at 11 o'clock in the morning than if you've had skim milk. And children who haven't had a certain amount of fat in their breakfast will be the ones who are dashing off to buy some sugary food, high energy food at break time, and probably overeating on them. So it's far more better to have a balanced whole food diet than to change things. Now, this is the 1984 COMA report, the Committee on Medicinal Aspects of Food, which recommended that we reduce saturated fat and fat in total. And 4 members of that committee who didn't have to declare their interests were actually consultants to the sugar industry at the time. And they ended up taking the attention away from sugar, which I personally believe has been one of the biggest problems. And here I've just put for you the key recommendation. The consumption of saturated fatty acids, asterisk, and of fat in the United Kingdom should be decreased. Now, the journalists all reported that without the asterisk, but if you look at the bottom of the page, that said inclusive inclusive of trans fatty acids. And what was happening at that time was they were confusing trans fats with saturated fats. That actually, although it sounds like an unhealthy thing, there's no fundamental reason why saturated fat is unhealthy. We actually reduced our intake of saturated fats quite considerably in the 1980s, and as you can see here, the incidence of coronary heart disease has fallen quite significantly. And so campaigners will point to this and say, look, I told you if we cut our saturated fat, it would get rid of and reduce our coronary heart disease. Therefore, if we drive it down even further, we'll reduce that more still. Is that true? Well, these are very hard to get data from what the incidence of coronary heart disease was in the early part of the 20th century. These are figures from the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, which showed that between 1920 and 1926 they didn't have a single case, didn't have a single heart attack in the hospital, but gradually over the years that increased, and by the 1970s they were getting 500 cases a year. If we put this together as best I can with the available data, we get this is not age adjusted. We get a rise of coronary heart disease, something like this, and a fall. And if I had the most up-to-date data, it probably falls a bit further. But is that just because of the way we've changed our diets, or in fact, would it fall even more because it's still a very large number of people who are dying or getting coronary heart attacks every day and cardiovascular disease like I did? Would things be even better if we hadn't changed? And here's one, just the number of coronary operations and interventions like bypass operations. We're having something like 95,000 coronary interventions, another 25,000 double bypass operations every year. Just here, this is American data because there is no UK data, but the saturated fat consumption during the 20th century, the red line, stayed broadly the same. The total fat consumption increased from polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats, which were being hydrogenated and turned into trans fats. And here you can see the big rise of these trans fats in the food system. Now, if we plot the graph of coronary heart disease against this, there's no correlation between the fat consumption, the saturated fat consumption and heart disease. If we put sugar on here, you get a much better correlation. There's a gap of something like 20 years, 20 or 30 years, but you don't drop dead from having a high sugar diet straight away. And I'll leave it at that. But I will make my slides available if anybody wants to look through them in more detail afterwards. Okay.